Okay, we want to continue our study in Romans pretty soon, but first we're going to talk about the prodigal son just for now because I think it's important for several reasons. So we have the story of the prodigal son that people think is interpreted like this. So there's a guy in church and he decides to leave God and he goes away and sins a lot because he's rebelling against God, and then decides he comes to his senses and he comes home and God welcomes him back. And then the people that are in the church who stayed in the church and didn't rebel or sin or quote unquote have fun, they are mad. They are the older brother that is angry that God is welcoming the prodigal son who was bad back into the church. And so the moral of the story is that we should all be happy that God loves people that reject him and are bad and live sinful lives. And then they come back and God will forgive and welcome everybody back into the family who does something like that. That's the Christianized version of the prodigal son. But what's really happening, I know I hear every now and then, I heard the other day someone say, who was a Christian, how difficult it is to stay in the game. Meaning to stay in their, this is another Christianese term, walk with God, to stay in relationship with God and not be a prodigal son who rebels and turns their back. And that is how we see Christianity or the Christian religion or Protestant evangelicalism. These kind of things, like there's an in and an out, that you can be in or out. You can live in it, and that means you're doing certain things, but then you can be out, and that means you're doing other things like, whatever, so-called sinning or ignoring God or these other things. Now, when we look at the New Testament, and you can research this yourself, what's going on? There isn't Christianity. So there isn't Christians in and other people out. What there is Hebrews, the line of Israel, those people who today we would call Jews. And there's Gentiles, which is everybody else. And that is what's in their minds, not Christians, non-Christians. All right, so the people that wrote the New Testament were in the line of Hebrew people. They were Jewish. Paul saw what Christ did as the fulfillment of his Jewish Hebrew lineage. Paul did not become a Christian as we think of Christians, although he was into Jesus and that mattered to him. It was just part of everything for him. It was part of what God was doing. There was no separation. There was no in and out group in Paul's mind. Jesus appeared to him. It was God. Okay, so back to the prodigal son. What's going on in the prodigal son? Now, mostly Jesus is talking about, in the Hebrew culture, you can see this in the New Testament again if you look for it, but it's not been pointed out to most of us who grew up in church and Christian church, that the Hebrew people were kind of self-focused on themselves and what God was doing with them, and the Gentiles were the out group. But in the history of Hebrew people, as we talked about before, the Gentiles were usually the ones that were attacking them and enslaving them and taking them away. So they didn't have a very good view of the Gentiles, anybody not Hebrew. They wanted to have their own identity as Hebrew people with God and live there, where God favored them. And part of their humanness was that they were not following what God said and blessing all nations. As a Hebrew nation, they were committed by God. They were commissioned to bless all the nations around them, but they didn't. In the time of Jesus, they certainly weren't. They were either in collusion with the Romans or just kind of focused on their own belly buttons and calling the Gentiles sinners and dogs and these kind of things. Now, Jesus and Paul are patching this up. And Paul in Romans that we're studying right now, his main thing is that God brought the Hebrews and the Gentiles together under Christ as one big family of God, one big Israel, as Paul says. Now, the prodigal son story. This is about Hebrews and Gentiles. The Hebrews are the older brother who stayed home, and the Gentiles are the ones that are the prodigal son that went off. Now, what's the evidence for that? In Ephesians, Paul has this sentence that says, "You as Gentiles were once far off, but then you've been brought near by Christ." The same language is used in the parable of the prodigal son. The prodigal son goes far off. He goes away, he's far off, and then he comes back. And when he comes back, the Father welcomes him. Now, we know from Romans that the Gentiles are grafted into the family of God for free. They don't have to do anything. And in the prodigal son story, this story is meant for the Hebrew people that saw Hebrews and Gentiles as an in-out group. And since the Gentiles were out, then they weren't part of us, and we can treat them however we want. This is what Jesus is trying to patch up. So the prodigal son comes back, and it's the Gentiles being included into the family of God. God welcomes them, and the older brother, who is the Hebrews, is upset about this because they had to follow the law. I mean, they had God on their side, but Paul called the law a burden and a ministry of death. And it was rough, and there was consequences if they didn't follow the law that weren't, and the Gentiles were never under that law. They weren't under that system. Now, according to the Bible, they didn't have the good things of being that in that close of a relationship with God. Not that God didn't deal with, he did things in Gentile humanity as much as he did in Hebrew humanity. We know that from the Bible. It's clear about that. But so that's the thing. The older brother is the Hebrew people that are angry that the Gentiles are just being included for free into the family of God. So this story, like this idea that we live in some kind of Christian system where we can turn our backs on God, or we can rebel, or if we go out and supposedly sin and all this other stuff, then we need to come back and God will welcome us back. All this, that in-out binary dichotomy does not exist in the prodigal son story. But that is the origin of where this idea of I need to stay in the game comes from. Because apparently, according to the prodigal son, as a Christian, I can go out. I can go far away from God. I can sin and I'm away from God. Well, that interpretation causes that binary. But it doesn't exist. It's not there. The prodigal son story was meant for the Hebrews, and we can look in and see what it meant to them, and that's the thing that it means to us. So to us, we rest in God, we rest in the finished work of Christ, we are resting in a loving relationship with God, and all Jews and Gentiles, Hebrews, Gentiles, everybody is one big Israel. We are, as Gentiles, grafted in for free. We don't go away and go sin and do bad things and have to be welcomed back by God. That is what the importance of getting the prodigal son parable correct is. And that's why I'm out here in the middle of the desert speaking to you. Because it matters. It means a lot. It changes everything that we get this accurate. Okay. That's enough for now, and I'll see you later.